Okay. I think we're now live on YouTube. So for anybody who's watching, whatever point in time you're watching, thank you for watching it and joining another episode of this YouTube show Bible study I'm doing called What's the Rush, where we just take our time going through scripture, and we have been going through the book of Ezekiel, and now we're on chapter 19. Before I get any further, I just want to introduce the guest that I have today, who is the pastor of Keysville Good Shepherd Church of the Nazarene in way, 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 way upstate New York, right? Pastor Noelle Eichenberger.
Yes, thanks for having me on.
Yes, of course. Is there anything that you want to, share to introduce yourself, introduce who you are, your ministry, what you do?
Yeah, sure. So again, I'm Pastor Noelle, and I've been the lead pastor at Keysville Good Shepherd for a little over 4 years now. We are a small church, but we have a very big God, and we've just been very blessed in our ministry to the community. We're about to launch a new ministry called the Hope Kitchen. And our three goals are eat, educate, empower. So it's feeding people, food and nutrition classes, kitchen rentals. But just really, we have a heart for our community, and we have a heart for eliminating food insecurity in our community. So that's really the big push behind it. And, one of the easiest ways to introduce people to Jesus is meeting a basic need. So that's where we're going to start. Yeah, and I'm a wife and a mom and a dog mom. I am ordained in the Church of the Nazarene, and I'm currently a student in the MDiv program at Nazarene Theological Seminary. And I think that's it.
It's quite the list, but
Yeah.
that the ministry that you're doing at the church there with the food kitchen, sounds really awesome. Sounds like it'll be a really huge benefit to the community,
Yeah.
and a really great way to show, the love of God.
Mhm. Yeah, it's been just amazing the connections that we've built already and the partnerships that we've created, and just um it's opened up a lot of doorways that we haven't had previously, like just being a church. So we're excited to get moving, and we're so close.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Well, I'll be praying that everything continues to work out, and if anybody's watching, just keep that ministry in prayer as well, that, God blesses that ministry.
Yes, prayer is always very appreciated.
Awesome. Yeah, and thanks for again being willing to join to talk about Ezekiel. I think if I remember correctly, I think you guys at your church, you're going through the prophets or the minor prophets or all of the prophets or
We are doing the minor profits. We'll
okay.
probably do the major profits at some point, but for the summer, we're going through the minor profits, and it's been a wild ride.
Awesome. Awesome. So I guess, Ezekiel kind of fits right in with some of those prophets in the
Yeah.
timeline. So that's good. Well, before we uh, go read Ezekiel chapter 19, I'm just trying to think if there's any kind of anything else I need to say at the introduction. For anybody watching, if you're new to the channel, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel. And if this is something that you have found, valuable, or you find, valuable and helps you in your walk with God, definitely share it. And this is the 34th episode of this done, so definitely, go back and watch previous or listen to previous episodes as well. There's a lot of good stuff on Ezekiel. So before we read Ezekiel 19, is there anything that you want to share, kind of maybe about the background, or anything that you think we should know before we read it? Maybe like introductory or anything like that.
Yeah, I think the big thing that just stuck out to me is that it's kind of been a downward spiral for Israel. And I I'm a preacher and a pastor. Like, I always try to look for the hope in the passage, and there's not really a whole lot of hope. And I think there's a little bit toward the end, but it's really just, I mean, it says right in there, like, this is a lament. And we're looking at the exile timeline and just some not great kings, and that's kind of a common theme throughout a lot of the Old Testament.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, I've found that with Ezekiel too, is, it kind of Ezekiel and Jeremiah and some of these other prophets, the minor prophets, as I'm sure you're seeing, they just kind of make you sit with things aren't good. We
Yeah,
have to really recognize, I guess, how bad things might be before but in a sense it contrasts, and it when we do get to the hope, especially in Ezekiel, which is not certainly not every chapter, it really it really makes the hope shine that much brighter when we do get to it.
yeah. Well, and I think too, it's important to read these texts because I feel like the church today really, we always try to go for the feel good chapters. And I think it's really important for us to learn how to read and study these. So I commend you for what you're doing on this show, like just kind of doing a slow roll through this book, because I think it's important for us to also learn how to kind of sit in that tension of, like, yes, God loves us and God is sovereign, but he's also just, and he takes the covenant seriously. And not only what does this mean for the Israelites, but what does that mean for us in this time? And we've got a very, kind of very different Christianity, like very individualized. And so, what does that mean for us as we think about this from a communal standpoint, too?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Well, I appreciate that. And you mean that there's more to Ezekiel than just the dry bones coming alive?
Yes. I
You mean
mean,
that's
I
not the
love
whole
that
book?
the Lauren Daigle song. I love that song,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
there's more to it. And I think there's a lot to be learned from the lament and the warning and, the hard situations. So it's important to, again, to wrestle with that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think chapter 19 will help us do that. So why don't we go ahead and read chapter 19 then?
All right.
And it's 14 verses, and it's kind of two different sections, but do you want to read the first 7 verses, and I'll read the second 7 verses?
Sure. Sounds good.
And what translation do you typically study or read from?
So I bounce around. I've been preaching from the CEB, but I've been reading the NRSV lately. That's kind of
Okay.
my first love, if you will. So I'm reading in the NRSV.
Okay. Yeah, awesome. I'll be reading from the NRSV also.
All right, cool. So this is Ezekiel 19, and it says, "As for you, raise up a lamentation for the princes of Israel, and say, what a lioness was your mother among lions. She laid down among young lions, rearing her cubs. She raised up one of her cubs. He became a young lion, and he learned to catch prey. He devoured humans. The nations sounded an alarm against him, and he was caught in their pit. And they brought him with hooks to the land of Egypt. And when she saw that she was thwarted, that her hope was lost, she took another one of her cubs and made him a young lion. He prowled among the lions, and he became a young lion, and he learned to catch prey. He devoured people, and he ravaged their strongholds and laid waste their towns. The land was appalled and all in it at the sound of his roaring.
The nations set upon him from the provinces all around. They spread their net over him. He was caught in their pit. With hooks, they put him in a cage and brought him to the king of Babylon. They brought him into custody so that his voice should be heard no more on the mountains of Israel. Your mother was like a vine in a vineyard, transplanted by the water, fruitful and full of branches from abundant water. Its strongest stem became a ruler's scepter. It towered aloft among the thick boughs. It stood out in its height with its mass of branches, but it was plucked up in fury. Cast down to the ground, the east wind dried it up. Its fruit was stripped off, its strong stem was withered. The fire consumed it. Now it is transplanted into the wilderness, into a dry and thirsty land. And fire has gone out from its stem, has consumed its branches and fruit, so that there remains in it no strong stem, no scepter for ruling. This is a lamentation, and it is used as a lamentation. So there we have Ezekiel 19, 1 through 14. So what are some of your kind of initial thoughts or comments or observations or, questions or whatever that might be?
Well, I think like my research, it talked about it was the two last kings of Israel. And I thought it was interesting, just, Israel is kind of described as a man eater. Um, like learning to tear flesh and devouring humans and just having gone from, you see the Israelites in the Exodus, and they're oppressed and they're slaves, and they're just seen as property, to they get a little bit of power and they just are totally poisoned. um but yeah, and just I think the imagery here, like I love the poetic imagery and the symbolism that they have here with the lion and the vine, and there's a lot.
Yeah, there's a lot of good. I think those are good images, definitely. Yeah, when I was reading some of the commentaries, there was a lot of debate between exactly which uh Jewish kings or which Jerusalem
Yeah,
kings or
it was
Judite kings.
Zedekiah or
Yeah,
Jehoiakim, or yeah.
yeah, yeah. But and we'll talk about that. But I think also it's important to remember that it may not necessarily be about exactly like which king these
Yes,
represent, but more kind of the bigger picture of what this is telling overall.
absolutely. I also, there was a little bit of connection, I feel like, to Jacob's blessing on Judah,
Yeah,
Genesis 49. I have it up on my computer.
yeah,
If
yeah.
let me pull that up.
I think
Okay.
this is where we get the Lion of Judah, right?
Yeah, so this is starting in verse 8. It says, Judah, your brothers will praise you. Your hand will be on the neck of your enemies. Your father's sons will bow down to you. You are a lion's cub, Judah. You return from the prey, my son. Like a lion, he crouches and lies down. Like a lioness, who dares to rouse him? The scepter will not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until he to whom it belongs shall come, and the obedience of the nations shall be his. He will tether his donkey to a vine, his colt to the choicest branch. He will wash his garments in wine, his robes in the blood of grapes. His eyes will be darker than wine, and his teeth whiter than milk. So, really, I mean, the whole poem, both sections, there's connection to that blessing on Judah, which I thought was really, really interesting.
Yeah, yeah. We see there, that this idea of referring to Judah as a lion, and definitely it picks up here, in Ezekiel with this idea of the lioness, raising her young cubs. So we get that idea, that connection with Judah there, which is an important connection. I found it interesting as you were reading that in Genesis 49, the blessing given, it says that the scepter shall never leave
Yeah.
Judah. Yet in Ezekiel, it talks about like the scepter is no more
Yeah.
in Ezekiel 19. But when we get to, the birth of Jesus, who is of the tribe of Judah, we see that, even though they may have thought the scepter was no more, and in a very real way, I guess in a kind of earthly kingship kind of way, it was, but that lineage continued on through Jesus, and Jesus is the one who holds that scepter. So
Yeah.
uh, that blessing, continued to remain true throughout history.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like in Isaiah where he says, how long, Lord? And it's like the scepter disappeared, but it wasn't totally gone.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It, it disappears in a way where God's like, well, I think, we tried this kingship thing and it didn't quite work out. We tried it for a long time, and yeah, it's not working anymore. But
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
I always think about too, and maybe I'm taking a course on judges this summer,
Okay,
but I always think about it's in the end of Joshua. It's Joshua 24, and it's where they're accepting their their gift, their land from God. And Joshua says to them, like, don't take this unless you're going to stick to this covenant. And if you can't stick to the covenant, don't enter into it. And the people, they say, oh, yeah, we can do this. That's great. And then Joshua says, like, this is what God says, like, he's going to destroy you if you break this covenant. And I think it's a hard concept to wrap our minds around because again we have Jesus and we see this love for us and this death on the cross for us, and yet there's this passage where God is saying like I'm going to let you reap the consequences of these actions. And I feel like it's not just in the book of Judges, it's in the minor prophets too, and the exile and all of these battles and losses. I don't know. I keep going back to that passage in
yeah,
Joshua.
yeah, yeah. Well, I mean that's an important theme of the Old Testament too. But it's important to remember, that like God doesn't let us just reap the consequences just and then like cut us off, but he
Yeah.
does it, I think, as a way for his people to learn and
Yeah, to
grow.
learn and to return too.
Yeah, yeah,
Because,
absolutely.
the other theme you have is the people cry out and God laments. And I think too, we see so much if you really read the Old Testament, you see so much of God's humanity and his desire for relationship with us. And I think we a lot of times we kind of brush through that and rush through it. And um yeah, it's interesting like reading passages like this because, what is God's feeling? What is God's thought as he's seeing his people, his children do these ridiculous things?
Yeah, yeah, I was thinking about that too. Like even if we were there with Ezekiel when he was perhaps sharing this with whoever he might have shared it with, elders or people around him in Babylon, and this was still like 5 years from when Babylon would actually sack Jerusalem. So it
Yeah.
was almost kind of like he was lamenting for the future, like he was processing his grief and
Hmm.
maybe trying to help the exiles, also process their grief ahead of time, get them ready for it.
Yeah.
So and so it's they're getting ready to see what's going to happen and process it. Um, and I think putting ourselves in their shoes or in their sandals or whatever they might have worn, and we can probably imagine that they were kind of like, well, this is it. After reading 19, because the scepter is gone, the
Yeah.
vineyard is gone, there are no more lions. That's kind of what they're getting in this snapshot. They might be thinking this is it. But then like the hope you talked about, God has that kind of, yet still to play out. And when, as we continue reading, we see that.
Hmm.
But but God kind of still makes them sit with their grief and kind of process their grief and kind of process the consequences of what's
Hmm.
going on.
Definitely.
So I mean, as we look at it's kind of broken down into two parables. So
Yeah.
as we look at the first parable, Um, what are some of your thoughts about who these lions represent? Because we mentioned earlier, a lot of different commentators think they
Yeah.
represent very different people.
Yeah, so I got a couple of different interpretations. So one of the interpretations that I saw was that it is Israel and Judah. I was just looking at
Okay.
my notes. And then another interpretation said, oh, it's Jehoahaz. I might be saying that wrong. And
Yeah.
then Jehoiakim, and then someone said, no, it's not Jehoiakim, it's Zedekiah. Um, and again, it's one of those things, it's like there's a lot of just really not great kings throughout this whole time period. Um, Most of the commentaries that I looked at, they kind of said it's it's kind of the end of the kings. So it's two of the last kings that they
Yeah.
had.
Yeah.
Um, but it's really just, yeah.
I mean, it might help to kind of think about who these last kings of Judah were.
Yes.
Um, so in 609, the last kind of good king, or
Mm.
mostly good king, died, and that was King Josiah. Read Josiah's reforms. Josiah was like the last king who found favor in God's eyes. And then he had multiple sons. The next king who took over after Josiah was Jehoahaz,
Mhm.
and then he was young. He was 23.
Yeah.
Jehoahaz was 23 years old, and he only ruled for 3 months in Jerusalem, and then Egypt took him in
Yeah.
captivity.
And I think that's why they seem to think that that first lion was him because they
Yeah,
tied him with hooks to the land of Egypt.
yeah, that's what was one of the interpretations I was reading too, is that because they mentioned this young kind of lion, right?
Hmm.
And Jehoahaz was one of the younger kings at that point, taken to Egypt, that a number of people thought it must refer to Jehoahaz. Um, and then once after Jehoahaz was taken to Egypt, his his brother Jehoiakim,
Hmm.
with an M.
He was exiled, yeah, in 597.
Well, no, that was Jehoiakim with
Yeah.
an N.
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. You're right. You're right.
It's hard. The names sound very familiar. It's like an M and an N.
Yeah.
It's different. Um, but Jehoiakim then became king until 598,
Hmm.
when he died, when Babylon was invading. Then his son Jehoiakim, who's Josiah's grandson, then he became king for only a few months also, and he was also young, 18 years old. Uh, and then he was taken to Babylon, at
Yeah.
which point Babylon put Jehoiakim's brother, or Jehoiakim's uncle, Zedekiah,
Hmm.
into power. So we have a lot of like moving pieces within
Yeah.
that within that decade, which is a little bit confusing. But yeah, that's one of the commentaries was convinced, and I think it's a pretty good argument, is that it's the first line is Jehoahaz taken to
Yeah.
Egypt, exiled in Egypt, and the second young lion is Jehoiakim, who was
Yeah.
only also young, and then only reigned for a short period of time, and then taken to Babylon.
Yeah.
But I mean, you made the point earlier about this second lion that was like, this Ezekiel 19 describes the second lion as not a very good image.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The flesh devourer and the man
Yes.
eater.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, it's kind of like, but I was thinking about too. I was like, well, Jehoiakim only ruled for about a few months. I mean, did he even have enough
Yeah.
time to be this awful?
I mean, it's possible.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Uh, I
Yeah,
think
one
it's
of the, oh, sorry, go ahead.
no, you go ahead.
Well, I was gonna say, like in verse 7, this might be the CEB translation, but it says he ravaged their widows and laid waste to their cities when the earth and everything in it became horrified by the sound of his raging. The nations from the surrounding regions allied against him, and they cast their nets over him and caught him in their trap.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, definitely not some good things. And I mean, well, in previous chapters of Ezekiel too, guy kind of lays out the sins,
Yeah.
and it's not necessarily even. I don't think like one king is responsible for all these. I think God is laying out the sins of multiple generations of kings, is saying,
Hmm.
all this has kind of added up, and now it's time to deal with it.
Yeah, the idol worship and the, you know, not staying faithful to the covenant, and at some point something's got to give.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, I was reading. This is Second Kings 24. In it says Jehoiakim uh, did not find favor in the sight of the Lord. He did evil. He did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, just as all his ancestors had done. And then Jehoiakim also, even though 3 months in 24:9, Second Kings, he also did evil in the sight of the Lord, just as his father had done. So I mean, they they weren't like wonderful wonderful people. They didn't exactly smash the idols and return back to worshiping God.
Yeah. Well, and then even later on, it talks about like Zedekiah's in there, and it says my note says his rebellion provokes the destruction of Jerusalem and the end of
Yeah,
the Judean kingdom. And I think I always go back to Deuteronomy and the Shema, and you know, what were they doing? They weren't following that most important command of
yeah,
meditating on it day and night, and they weren't teaching their children. And there's just this lack of, it wasn't even following God, it was just a basic lack of familiarity with God. And there were still, it was almost like an insurance clause of, yeah, we'll do an offering, but they didn't know who they were
yeah,
worshiping. It's like an
yeah,
Acts when Paul's talking about, it's like to an unknown God. And that's really, it's really kind of depressing because how faithful had God been through the Exodus and through the entrance into the promised land, and the people just like over and over and over grew further and further away from him.
yeah, yeah. And it's I mean, like maybe we shouldn't be surprised, but even only in a few generations, it can be so easy for a whole, nation
Yeah.
or a whole, kingdom to just
Mhm.
forget, like you said, like Josiah, right?
Yeah.
Who was these kings' father and grandfather.
Hmm.
He like rediscovered the law, and then he had the prophetess Huldah come and kind of reteach him about the law, and he was like, man, we've really been messing up.
Yeah.
We need to get back to this. And they like refound everything in the archives and stuff like that, and to dedicate back to the law. um it's actually interesting because God at that point was like, well, even if you're gonna follow the law once again, it's actually too late for Judah.
Yeah.
I'll spare judgment until after you're dead, Josiah, but it's still too late. That's the only concession that God made with that. He's like,
Yeah. I always
I'll
love
just wait a
that.
little bit longer until you die.
Like you're good, but no one else will be.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, another one of the commentaries I was reading thinks that Zedekiah was the second lion. So
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
interesting to see that too.
Yeah. The first one, I feel like the first one, it's kind of, they're mostly in agreement, but the second lion, there's a little bit of
Yeah.
as far as who it is.
And
So
I found some argument about who they think the mother lioness might be too. Like if there's an actual person, like if it's Zedekiah and Jehoiakim's
Joseph's
mother.
mother, yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Well, and if you go that direction, it could be. Um, but then yeah, and yeah, some of the commentary said it's the nation of
yeah,
Israel,
yeah,
and some say it's a real, a person.
yeah. So what do you think? What is your thought? After reading everything about arguing who these different people represent, what's your thoughts?
I think for me, I guess I would go for the nation of Israel as my interpretation. Um, and that's just kind of, I feel like in scripture, a lot of times, well, especially the Old Testament in particular, when they're talking about specific kings, they're representative of the nation. And so their actions are often representative of the nation. And so in this case, I mean, they were led, they were exiled as the second lion was. And I don't know, I guess that's kind of where my mind goes because the sins of one are the sins of the community, the nation. So whether that's correct or
Okay.
not, I don't know. But
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, if different commentaries are arguing about who it is, I don't know if we're
yeah.
gonna find an answer until you meet God and ask him this obscure question about Ezekiel 19.
Where do you land on that?
My thoughts are I don't think the mother lioness represents a specific person. I think the mother lioness is representative of kind of like that royal lineage of the house of Judah.
Yeah.
That's what I think. But I do think my thoughts are that the two lion cubs, the first represents the Jehoahaz, and the second represents Jehoiakim, just
Mhm.
because of the parallel that there were two young
Brother.
kings who reigned for only a few months, and
Hmm.
one was, historically taken to Egypt in exile, and another one was historically, taken to Babylon in exile.
Hmm.
So those are my thoughts. I think that perhaps too, the second lion cub may also, in a sense, include Jehoiakim's father, Jehoiakim,
Hmm.
just because I just don't feel like 3 months is a lot of time to commit
That much
that much,
chaos.
evil. But I'm sure he committed enough. But
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. But I mean, these sins that they mark out, it's just sins that represent
Yeah.
um the sins of the leaders against their own people.
Hmm.
So yeah, yeah. Do you have any other thoughts on this first parable?
I think we covered most of them. I have more thoughts on the second one.
Okay, yeah. Well, yeah. Why don't we go into the second parable? So what do you think about the second parable?
Oh my goodness. There is a lot there. And I think kind of the overarching theme that I got as I was reading this and as I'm looking at different commentary is that, the wrath against the vineyard is a result of failed expectations. Um, the neither plant performed the proper role. So, um, let me see. Do, 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 do. Yeah, so the mother started out, transplanted by water, fruitful, full of branches. The strongest stem became a ruler's scepter, but then it sounds like a good thing. It towered and it had thick boughs and it stood out in height and it had massive branches, but I'm married to a farmer. And it's like, I think about tomato plants, and tomato plants, you actually have to go and you have to prune off some of the vines. And they call them, the reason they do that is they call them suckers because it takes the energy away from the fruit.
Oh,
And
yeah,
so the taller and more lush the vine and the branches get, the less fruitful the tree is. And so,
okay,
there's a lot, I get kind of themes of pride and themes of, being power hungry, but there wasn't fruit being bared
yeah,
there.
yeah. That those like that idolatry, might
Yes.
be another one of those kind of suckers.
Hmm.
Yeah, yeah. That's I think that's a really good way to think about it. Um, it's kind of it's kind of a continuation of this theme that Ezekiel's already been building.
Hmm.
Um, in Ezekiel chapter 15 and Ezekiel 17,
Yeah.
he builds on this, an analogy, his parable of a vineyard. Um, and it's an image that we see throughout the Old Testament and also the New Testament as well as, God's people as this vineyard,
Uh,
that God
do you,
plants and it's supposed to be fruitful, and then it kind of, fails.
yeah. Do you mind if I read 15? I had that
Yeah,
marked.
yeah. Go ahead.
All right. So this is through. Okay, so this is chapter 15. It says, "The word of the Lord came to me, O mortal, how does the wood of the vine surpass all other wood? The vine branch that is among the trees of the forest. Is wood taken from it to make anything? Does one take a peg from it on which to hang any object? It is put in the fire for fuel. When the fire has consumed both ends of it, and the middle of it is charred, is it useful for anything? When it was whole, it was used for nothing. How much less, when the fire has consumed it and is charred, can it ever be used for anything? Therefore, thus says the Lord God, like the wood of the vine among the trees of the forest, which I have given to the fire for fuel, so I will give up the inhabitants of Jerusalem. I will set my face against them, although they escape from the fire. The fire shall still consume them, and you shall know that I am the Lord when I set my face against them. And I will make the land desolate because they have acted faithlessly, says the Lord God." And this is going to sound crazy,
No, go
but
ahead.
this is where I got the hope piece out of this. Because again, you get that pruning. Um, and it's like, a lot of times when we prune plants back, it's shocking and it's scary because you're like, is this gonna come back? Because it almost feels like it's dead. But in order for there to be fruit, you have to cut off the the parts that aren't working. You have to cut off the dead pieces. And so it's almost like God is kind of clearing the landscape and starting from scratch, as bad as that sounds. But in order for the scepter, going back to that metaphor, to return. And so that I was kind of reading and I was like, it doesn't feel very hopeful when you're reading it on its own, but when you think about how you take care of plants and how you harvest, there has to be a season of pruning. And what better place to start, like when they are in the wilderness? Like now it's transplanted into the wilderness, and that I'm assuming is pointing to the exile, into a dry and thirsty land. But it's like that is where hope and something new is going to spring forth from. So
Yeah, yeah. And in Ezekiel 17, it gets more specific as to,
yeah.
Babylon coming in and transplanting the vineyard, and, Zedekiah's role in it. But I really like that point too. It's like a forest fire. Like we almost often, think of forest fires as these terrible, destructive things,
Mhm.
which in a very real sense they are. Um, but also in a very real sense, they provide an opportunity for new life. Like a forest fire is a natural a natural thing that happens that brings completely new life to an
Yeah.
area after the old life
Yeah.
is cleared out. Um, and then that's kind of the same point. Um, and going back to what you said also about opportunity for people to just kind of really focus on that.
Hmm.
I think it's very clear with what God is doing. Almost in a sense, as terrible as it sounds, with the forest fire burning up the vineyard, destroying the vineyard. Again, God's not doing it to just destroy it and be done with it, but God's doing it to allow new life to happen
Yeah.
within Israel, within Judah.
Yeah. Well, and it points to the difference between our version of success compared to what God's version is. Like verse 11, it says, she produced mighty branches fit for rulers, scepters. She grew tall. Her crown went up between the clouds. Because of her height and thick growth, she became conspicuous. And, that's where we kind of associate success is fame and power and prestige. And it's like, that's not how God has modeled success for us.
Right.
You
Yeah.
know, what we see is totally different from God sending the Messiah as a baby, like
Yeah.
two
Yeah.
very different things. Um, and so, the cutting down, it forces some humility for the Jewish people too. Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
That success in God's eyes is more of a humility, right? That we have. It's being humble before God. That's what God, I think, sees as success.
Hmm.
Like you said, it's not about uh, being conspicuous, being prideful, all those kinds of things. But
Yeah.
perhaps the most important thing in being successful in God's eye is just being humble before God.
That's
That's
a hard
incredibly
one.
important. Because it's opposite, right?
Yeah.
It's countercultural,
Yeah.
opposite to what we want.
I always think about too, one of my seminary professors, I remember asking the question about the exile because um they always talked about how, no place is it's Scott Daniels, so this is definitely like a Scott Daniels phrase, but no place is God forsaken because God has been to all places of forsakenness. And I remember asking the question, what about the 400 years of silence? Like, what about the exile? And I loved his comment, and it was something that I'd never really thought about before. He made the comment that it wasn't that God was silent, it was that the Jewish people had to learn how to hear God in a new language.
Yeah.
And I really loved that because I feel like even for us, and this is kind of a rabbit trail, so I apologize.
Oh, no,
I do that when I preach too. But
it's
it's like
okay.
even for us, we a lot of times we're like, oh, we're not hearing from God and everything is failing and everything's being cleared away and nothing is going right. And really, is it that, or is it that God's pruning? That, is it that we need pruning in order to hear from him? And it's like we're so distracted all of the time. And maybe it's not ruling a nation, but it's trying to get followers on YouTube, sorry, or Instagram or something else, how often do we just get distracted by these other things, even if they're good things? Um, and so how is God kind of shaking us awake?
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, when I read in Daniel, the 490 years, uh, God's angel, I think it's Gabriel, makes it very clear to Daniel that the 490 years are not just like sit around and
Mhm.
twiddle your thumbs.
Yeah,
He makes it clear that the 490 years are like take time to do things right and get your heart right before God.
yeah.
And it's
Go
like
to the garden and
yeah, and
have
and and
children and get married. Yeah.
and I'm sure the Jewish people were probably like, oh no, we can do that in a year. God's like, no, you need to do this in centuries. Like
You've
it,
got
it took,
time to perfect this.
yeah, yeah. So it's also the same thing for us is like, don't just try to rush through that time period where we focus on,
Mhm.
building on God. But if God's even telling his own people, like, you need to take half a millennia to prepare your hearts in humility, even without a king, like you're not even gonna have a king. You're going to be ruled by other nations. God's saying use that for humility. It's the same thing for us. Just like, focus on that humility. So, I mean,
Absolutely.
I think that 490 years in Daniel kind of illustrates perfectly what our now General Superintendent, Scott Daniels was saying is that God wasn't absent from them. He was calling them during that time to focus on him and,
Mhm.
prepare their hearts for him.
Yeah. And how often do we get our focus on the things that don't matter?
Yeah, 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 definitely, definitely. I was what a few of the commentaries I read suggested that this particular stem that kind of stood out, maybe his was conspicuous or whatever it might be, might have been Zedekiah, might have referred to Zedekiah because of how he kind of became very proudful or prideful and then rebelled against this covenant that he made with Babylon, bringing Babylon's wrath upon them.
Yeah.
But I think that could be a possibility. Um, Also, just representative of Judah itself as well.
Yeah. And again, just the imagery used there is just so intricate and so detailed. And it's
Yeah,
such a sharp contrast. Like you have this beautiful, lush plant next to water, and it's tall and conspicuous, and then it's struck down and dried out,
yeah, yeah.
thrown into the fire.
Yeah, when I was reading as well, and I guess your husband would probably know this as a farmer, I'm sure. I'm probably sure you know as well. Like if winds come from a certain direction, it brings rain, it brings like good things. But if they come from a different direction, that winds can destroy the crop,
Yeah.
dry it out. So I guess with an east wind, it's coming from the east and it brings whatever bad conditions,
Hmm.
and it dries out the crop. So I guess the people of Judah would have known this, being a agricultural society. Um, so and that imagery, you were talking about a representative of the east wind, they would have known, well, the east wind is also Babylon destroying Jerusalem, Judah, as well, kind of transplanting it into exile, that dry and thirsty land.
Yeah. It's kind of interesting too. This just jogged my memory. I was reading something about, well, and it's in scripture, but like they went east of Eden when they left the garden, and so the
Oh
good
yeah,
wind
okay.
from the west and the bad wind.
Yeah,
I don't know if there's anything to that, but that just jogged my
yeah.
memory a little bit. But
No, I think that's a good connection. Yeah, that's a real good connection. Yeah. Any other thoughts on this second kind of parable that we have here?
I think too, it's the again just that idea of lament, and they're lamenting something that is coming, and it's the lament of the end of their sovereignty, their independence as a nation, and that that feels very, I think for me it feels a little uncomfortable,
Yeah,
given some of the political things that are happening in our country right now. And um but it's like what would that have felt like knowing that is coming, and how do we grieve that? And again,
Yeah.
is it also points to, are we so attached to needing to do things our own way that we're not willing to give things over to God and to trust him?
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, as you bring that up, it just kind of made me think too. How would the people that Ezekiel was may have been sharing this to would have received it? They may have been like, Ezekiel, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
This is this is
I think they
nuts.
were like
We're
that.
we're God's people. Of course, he's not going to let this happen. Ezekiel, you're crazy. And I don't think that's too far off the mark because like when we read Jeremiah,
Mhm.
right? Jeremiah is the true prophet, and he's like, people, listen, this isn't going to end up well. Babylon's going to destroy us. And the false prophets are the ones who are saying, no, Jeremiah, that's absolutely crazy. That's not going to happen at all. God's going to rescue us, and
Mhm.
Babylon will go away, and we're going to be just fine. It's like, the false prophets are telling them what they want to hear, and Jeremiah is telling them what they don't want to hear. And
Yeah.
maybe in Ezekiel's context, there with the exiles, it might be kind of similar.
Yeah. Well, and especially given some of the the delivery methods that Ezekiel had to use too.
That's true. That's true. That's true. Yeah. Very weird, strange thing. I guess, that's kind of the mark of a prophet, right?
Yeah. I don't know if you've watched, I love the description they give in the Bible Project video on Ezekiel.
Okay. Yeah.
But yeah, they have some good imagery, but also good detail on that.
Yeah. Yeah. Definitely. If we've seen some of those things, the cooking with dung,
Yes.
all those kinds of things, playing with little miniature figurines. And I'm sure that
Yeah.
people are like, what are you doing? What's wrong with this guy? Yeah. Yeah. But he's acting it out. He's acting out what's going to happen. I was kind of thinking about it, like, what's the application of this? What was the application for them? Like you said, it's lament.
Yeah.
It's just kind of like this song, this parable, this funeral dirge. One
Mhm.
commentary I read said it was, like a funeral dirge. It's like, what do you do with it? What do,
And
what
I
do we do with something like this?
and I think too, it's lament and grief are two of those emotions that we try to squelch and try to move past. And thinking about this in the context of who the original readers would have been, like this was something that they would have looked back on and said, oh,
Yeah,
um yeah. And I think again, it's hard there because my first inclination, I said this earlier, is to kind of rush through to the hope and say like, okay, where do I see God moving here? But there's also the reality of their nation was, for all intents and purposes, it was really kind of destroyed. It was cut down
yeah,
and
yeah.
completely obliterated. And
Yeah. I mean,
that,
I think as we look at it, I mean, the reality of life is that, bad things happen, tragic things happen, things that we can't always like comprehend, things that we can't always wrap our minds around.
Mhm.
I think this may have been one thing for these exiles, for, the people of Judah. And God, in a sense, is just kind of saying, giving them a way to kind of process it, a way to kind of grieve it, a
Yeah.
way to kind of just explain it in a parable. Um, and I think for even for us today, when bad things happen, when tragic things happen, I think something that this teaches us is we don't always need to rush to denial of it and then just act as if everything's happy and wonderful. That it's okay to take time to just kind of
Mhm.
sit and lament and grieve and process and figure out a way to just maybe like, it doesn't have to explain it fully, but just kind of like process it, even as a story.
Yeah, and I think that's the danger that we run into often is we try to say, well, God had a reason for this, and try to intellectualize it a lot of times, and there are times when you can't do that, and that's okay. And sometimes the best witness, the best response is to simply just listen and to walk with the person in grief, like be a safe place to let it out.
Yeah, yeah. Kind of like what Job's friends were supposed to be doing instead of what they did. They did, they did what we want to do. They wanted to explain it immediately. They wanted to kind of rush through that. But instead, God was saying, like, you guys should have just sat with Job and, been there with him. Um, but yeah, and I think it's part of our culture too, is that we try to, like you said, we want to intellectualize it. We want to be able to explain things right away and have an answer to things right away. And it's like, well, sometimes that's just not how it always works out.
Yeah.
It's okay to just sit and grieve, and it doesn't have to be a day. It can be weeks. It can be months.
Yeah.
Ezekiel, this was 5 years ahead of time. It was like you can grieve, for the loss of Jerusalem for the next 5 years.
Yeah.
Um, but that's part of, I think, the danger and the temptation of our culture is because we've been so accustomed to having everything instantaneously that we don't take time to grieve. We
Yeah.
don't take time to process.
Yeah. Something I've kind of been stuck on in my personal study and even in my preaching a little bit, um, is just we have a God who enters into the story. And that is such a beautiful and remarkable thing. And it's often, it's not that God enters in and completely, turns things upside down and we come out victorious, but it's he enters in and gives us audience and allows us to kind of do what we need to do, whether it's Job who, yells at God, or whether it's Jesus, I mean, Jesus was himself God, but him being able to say, if it's your will, take this from me so I don't have to do this. And just um giving us space to have real, authentic emotion, whether it's grief or joy or something else. Like, that's a really remarkable thing. And I think it's something that our culture is very uncomfortable with. And
Yeah, yeah,
something like for me, I've been really trying to be intentional about creating space for that, like just creating space for not even just authentic interaction, but like just authentic opportunity to listen. And again, just to enter in, not necessarily to be a hero, but just like meet, like truly, truly meet people where they are, wherever they are on their journey.
yeah, yeah. And I think too, building on that is that we don't have to know all the answers.
Hmm.
And even if we don't have all the answers, it doesn't have to be something that takes away from our faith in God, or takes away from our presence, wanting to be present with God. Because I don't think the point isn't to have all the answers, but the point is to just seek after God.
Yeah, definitely.
And then that's hard for us today, in the 21st century Western world, is because we want answers. It's like us saying, well, sometimes you don't always get the answers, and you got to learn how to be okay with that.
Yeah, and sometimes that's a beautiful thing.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
don't
you're
want to
right.
know
You're
all
right.
the answers.
Sometimes we don't want the answers. The guy's like, you don't want this answer, believe me. Yeah. Um, but another thing I was going to say is, um, you know, this is the idea of the parable and the poetry and
Mm.
processing it and kind of using that uh, in a very real sense, the artistic, kind of image that God has put within us that reflects Him to process things is a healthy way, I think of processing things. And that's, I think, one of the things that God is modeling here.
Hmm.
It's using this, poetry and this imagery and this parable to say this is a way that, you can process what's happening. This is the purpose of a lament.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So there we go. That's the application, right? Learn how to sit with grief. Not everything needs to put a smile on her face at the end of the day. Yeah, yeah. Yeah. Any other thoughts that you want to share on this chapter?
I think um I think we covered most of it and probably more than that, but
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think it was a great conversation.
yeah.
Yeah, thanks for joining. Um, any other thoughts in general that you want to share? Words of wisdom from Pastor Noelle.
Oh, I don't know that I have much wisdom. No, I think just I've been really grateful just for, I don't know if even if I would call it a revelation, but just that kind of like light bulb moment of, we don't have to be all things to all people. Like sometimes people just want to know that they're seen and they're loved, and we have the opportunity to do that as co-laborers. And
Yeah, yeah,
um a big part of that is walking with people through grief. Like there's a lot of heavy stuff happening in our world, and people are watching how we respond to that. So
yeah, yeah. And we can remember that, Jesus and the Holy Spirit walk with us in the midst of it.
yes, thank
Just as
goodness. Thank
just
God
as
for that.
yeah, just as God walked with Judah through the midst of what was happening to them,
Yeah,
even if it was, just. But God was still there with them. So, and we can reflect that presence to others around us.
absolutely.
Amen. Well, again, thank you for joining on this episode. I really do appreciate it, and I appreciate
Uh,
all of your input today.
Definitely. This was a lot of fun. Thank you for inviting me.
You're welcome. No problem. And definitely, share it with people if they want to watch it, you can say, look at these awesome things that I said about Ezekiel 19.
I'll probably refer them mostly to your part of the conversation.
Um, but if anybody's watching, definitely, and it's not about me getting massive amounts of subscribers or numbers, but really, I just want people to have an opportunity to, I guess, hear thoughts on the Old Testament and really
Yeah.
have an opportunity to learn about the character and the nature of God uh,
Yeah.
through Ezekiel.
Like I
So
said, I commend you. Like, I think this is fantastic. The more accessible that scripture is to people, the better, because there's a lot of misconceptions out there.
yeah, that's certainly that's certainly the truth, unfortunately. So, well, I guess with that, then we'll close. So thanks again for joining. If you're watching, like, share, subscribe, all that sort of stuff, and until next time, which I don't know when that'll be, but I pray that God will watch over you and bless you, and I truly pray that Jesus and the Holy Spirit have met you and challenged you in this conversation on Ezekiel 19 today. So, I just pray that God is with you and provides His presence and His blessing in your life, wherever and whenever you might be watching this. So, well, thanks again, Pastor Noel, and have a great evening.
Yeah, thanks, Pastor Eric. Have a good night.